Welcome to the ORICL Class. Yet even more stories from the Secret City. I'm Ray Smith, and I'm glad you're here with me today. Uh, we will get started in just a little bit. Some other folks are still coming on. And I'll remind you to keep your microphone muted unless you're speaking. And that way we won't get any random noise or feedback. And let me bring my screen up and tell you what we're going to do today. Right. So today is February the 26th, and we're going to talk about some stories. But first, we're going to answer the question. I don't know if she's on here now or not, but last week we had a question about where did the Q originate? Where did the Q come from in Q clearances? So I'm going to give you some information about that. It says, and this comes from an article that I wrote for at Y12 for the newspaper column that I produced for 9 years. And I have also put in the chat a link to all of those columns that I wrote. And then I've also added a link to all of my historically speaking columns. And you can just copy that out of the chat. So the need for security clearances became an issue after World War II, when the Manhattan Project was being transferred to the Atomic Energy Commission. A lot of people were going to be hired, and the Atomic Energy Act of 1947 required controls over access to restricted data and nuclear materials. Colonel Charles H. Bank, who was an intelligence officer under General Groves, proposed a formal security questionnaire to be used for all applicants. It asked relevant questions about loyalty, personal history, and so on, which were used to determine a person's suitability for a security clearance. The questionnaire was known as the Personnel Security Questionnaire, or PSQ. Now, because of the rush to hire so many people from the AEC, another of Groves' security officers at Los Alamos, Thomas O. Jones, was hired to implement that personnel security program. Jones wrote a regulation that established 3 types of clearances based on an individual's need for access to restricted data. As was the trend for the time, single letters of the alphabet were used. Jones took the P, the S, and the Q from Personnel Security Questionnaire form and used those letters for the 3 levels. P for employees having no access, S for frequent visitors, and then Q was for those with access to restricted data and security exclusion areas. It was the Q that required a full FBI background check. Interestingly, the military implemented an M clearance for non-civilian personnel who needed access to restricted data. And the AEC had the right to review the M clearance to ensure that comparable standards are being used. Today, the P and S clearances are no longer exist. Today's L, which is now common across the government, probably comes close to the original S clearance. According to Ernest Wagner of the K-H classifications, the L designation was the invention of the U.S. Navy's Admiral Rickover. When the Navy nuclear propulsion lab was added to the agency, Rickover didn't want to comply with all the requirements for the Q authorization. Therefore, the L, which stands for limited access, was adopted. It originally only applied to the naval nuclear information classified as confidential for research and development purposes. So the Q comes from that adaptation of the PSQ that started by the Atomic Energy Commission. All right, any thoughts or questions on that?
I have just a question. In the
Sure.
movie Oppenheimer, a lot of it was devoted to him losing his security clearance.
Yes.
There was that the Q clearance that they took away from him?
Uh, yes, he would have had a Q clearance. I'm not sure what other clearances might have been involved, if any. But I know from the Atomic Energy Commission, it would have been a Q clearance. And that's the highest clearance that they have. I'm not sure about the Department of Defense, but I do know about the what was in the Atomic Energy Commission or the DOE, and his clearance would have been a Q.
Thanks.
Uh-huh. Any other questions or thoughts? All right, let's make a transition here, and let me talk to you. You mentioned the Oppenheimer movie. It's now streaming on TV, so you can catch it on uh, several of the streaming channels. I know the Peacock channel has it, but I think you can get to it from a number of channels. I want to talk a little about Oppenheimer and Oak Ridge. This is a picture that was made up at the guest house by Ed Westcott. And you notice the mantle for the fireplace when Rick Dover brought the guest house back when he refurbished it. He tried to save as much of the original as he could. The floor to the main lobby is original, and the fireplace is. So the mantle is still there. I've taken this picture and placed it up on that mantle so you can see where the picture was made. And there's also a historical display. There's the picture over on the right. There's a historical display up there that uses a lot of Ed Westcott's photographs, has a timeline of the history around the guest house, and of course, some of the history about the hotel itself. And they welcome visitors to come into that main lobby and just look at those historical displays. So I would encourage you, if you've not gone up there to do that, that you might want to. And this is the chair. It's in the Oak Ridge History Museum that Oppenheimer was sitting in. And then there's the statue of Oppenheimer that's in the also in the Oak Ridge History Museum. I brought that one back from Washington, D.C. when the Atomic Heritage Foundation was through with it. I brought it back and we put it in the museum there at the Midtown Community Center. Any questions or comments about the Oppenheimer movie? How many of you have seen it? I got one, two, three. Okay. Several of you have already seen it. I think they've done a good job with it. I think my only criticism is of the way that Colonel Nichols is portrayed. I don't appreciate that. I think they missed his personality. I doubt that General Groves ever handed him his coat to get it clean. And the conversation, now he did not have an office in Los Alamos. He was in Oak Ridge and ran the Manhattan Project, Hanford, administrative responsibilities for Los Alamos and Oak Ridge. He ran all of that on the day-to-day operations. I would hope someone would one of these days make a movie about Nichols, but I don't know if that'll happen. He went to Los Alamos twice during the Manhattan Project. He went out there in March of 1943, and then he went out again in April of 1945. Now, the conversation between Oppenheimer and Nichols, when he handed him his security clearance, that's factual. That did happen. Only it happened in Chicago. And I can, of course, understand Christopher Nolan not wanting to create another set just for one single conversation. So he just had that happen at Los Alamos, which in fact it did not. It happened in Chicago. Any thoughts or questions about the Oppenheimer movie? What did you think of it? Tell me your impression.
Ray,
Yes.
this is Jackie. I thought it was well produced. I also appreciated the presentation that was done over at the library after we saw the movie. And just as a sidelight, a few days ago, I watched the movie Einstein, which they attributed everything that Einstein was shown saying in the movie was direct quotes, but it gives another thought about Einstein being a pacifist,
Mm-hmm.
but finding this necessary.
Yes.
So that's interesting too.
I have also seen that movie Einstein, and you're right. They use his words throughout the movie. So the things that they have him say, he actually said. So it's totally accurate. And you're right. He was a pacifist. He recognized the importance of the atomic bomb and did not want Germany to get it. But he also later on had regrets that he had had anything to do with bringing such an awful weapon into existence. And again, you have to remember he was basically a pacifist, so he wouldn't not appreciate war of any kind and would not want to have been part of it. So I wouldn't go so far as to say he regretted signing the letter. I would say that he regretted what the letter brought about.
Right.
I also just learned a few weeks ago from General Groves' grandson, Dick Groves, that President Roosevelt never actually read the letter. What happened is they gave the letter to Alexander Sachs, who was a personal friend of the president, and Sachs wrote an executive summary, a short paragraph of what was in the letter. And when he handed the letter to President Roosevelt, he had the summary on the top, and then the letter behind. And according to Dick, President Roosevelt just took and read the summary and made his decision based on what Sachs had pulled out of the Einstein letter. That's interesting if in fact that happened, because it shows the importance of a good executive summary of a multi-page document. Any other questions or comments about Oppenheimer the movie? If you wonder, was Oppenheimer ever in Oak Ridge? Yes, he was. His brother Frank actually lived in Oak Ridge and worked at Y-12. And we have records to show that Oppenheimer visited at least a couple of times. One time he actually had dinner in the Nichols house, and I brought Nichols a gift from Santa Fe, I believe, a small canister set, a wine decanter, and some glasses. So he was in Oak Ridge. He did send Richard Feynman to Oak Ridge to tell Tennessee Eastman not to store their uranium on either side of a concrete block wall. Tennessee Eastman didn't realize that those neutrons go right through that concrete block wall. So he told them how to store it safely. He also told General Groves that he should build the S-50 thermal diffusion plant because the Y-12's electromagnetic separation was so slow. It was taking a long time to separate that uranium-235. And Oppenheimer said the hardest part is getting it from 0.7% up to 1, 2, or 3%. So he suggested that they build a thermal diffusion plant and to put it up at the front end, that put it right by that steam plant over at the gaseous diffusion plant. And the reason was they couldn't use the electricity from the steam plant because they didn't have the barrier material for the gaseous diffusion process. So what they did was to go to the contractor and to say that General Groves told him, said, look, we need a thermal diffusion plant and we need it built in 90 days right here by this steam plant. The contractor said, that's impossible. Groves looked him in the eye and said, you've got 80 days. They built it in 76 days, operated it for 3 months, and they think it shortened the war by about 3 weeks. Okay, anything else on Oppenheimer? Next, I'm going to do a presentation for you that I have done a number of times about the history of women in the workplace during the Manhattan Project. And this picture that you're seeing is a view from a drone looking over the Oak Ridge National Laboratory. There's the Bull Run steam plant. There's Y12. That's the spallation neutron source. And the city of Oak Ridge is over in here. That's a really good view of the laboratory. All right, let's talk about women. If you've not read The Girls of Atomic City, shame on you. You should have. It's a book Denise Kiernan brought out in 2013. It was a bestseller on the New York Times bestseller list. She took a nationwide book tour. It was published in foreign languages. She's helping Oak Ridge by getting us to audiences that would not have known about us. We presented her with a Muddy Boot Award and gave her a key to the city. And this is the photograph that she saw that caused her to want to write that book. She called me and said, Ray, I want to write a book about the women in Oak Ridge. And I said, okay, I'll help you. I'll introduce you to them. And I only introduced her to one, Colleen Black. And Colleen took over from there and introduced her to everybody else. Now, this lady right here is what we call the first Calutron girl, because it is Gladys Owens, and she worked in Oak Ridge at Y12 from January till August of 1945. And then she left with the layoff that went after the war. And she was living up in Kentucky at the time. And her best friend got a job in Oak Ridge and sent her a letter and said, Gladys, you need to come to Oak Ridge and get a job. There's men down here. There wasn't any young men up in Kentucky. They'd all gone into the military, but the special engineer detachment was here in Oak Ridge. So that they had some young men, young Army soldiers. So Gladys came down, got her job, and worked until it got laid off after the war. Then in 2004, she came back and saw this picture at the American Museum of Science and Energy. So she told Steve Stowe, who was the director then, said, that's me in that picture there. Steve called me and said, Ray, I found you a Calutron girl. Now that's where that phrase came from. They didn't call them Calutron girls back in the day. They called them cubicle operators. These were the cubicles, and they were the operators of those cubicles. But when he said that, I started using Calutron girls to talk about them, and others picked up on that. And now everybody thinks of them as Calutron girls. And I think that's neat how a phrase can get introduced into our language. And us not really realize what we're doing until we've already done it and see the effects of it. I took Gladys out to Y12, set her on one of those wooden stools, and took her picture here by the Calutrons. And she said, Ray, I never did know what I was doing when I was working out here. Can you show me? I said, yeah, Gladys, I can show you. So I opened up one of these cabinets. I said, Gladys, when you were adjusting those knobs, And that's what they did for the entire shift. It's just a knob to keep a needle on a certain point. Let it drift to a control point and then bring it back. I said, when you were doing that, you were changing a rheostat, the value of a rheostat down here. She reached over and tapped me on the arm. She said, Ray, I still don't know what I was doing, but I know if I had any bobby pins in my hair, they'd just go stick to the wall somewhere. Largest magnets in the world at the time. So they would pull the bobby pins out of a lady's hair. Now, there's something else that we've done with this Kayatron girl concept. We have created Katie the Kayatron girl. Katie Watt at the Explore Oak Ridge has created this, and actually Katie the Kayatron girl is now the spokesman for the Explore Oak Ridge. So let's watch this little short clip of Katie the Kayatron girl.
Well, hello again. It's Katie the Calyutron girl, and Oak Ridge, Tennessee has been my home since the 1940s. So much has changed. Now that we don't have to keep it zipped anymore, we're sharing our secrets with everybody. Well, it's now time for me to share one of my secrets with you. What exactly is a Calyutron girl? Time for a history lesson from yours truly. In 1932, Ernest Lawrence invented the Calyutron machine in his lab at the University of California, Berkeley, to split uranium-235 from uranium-238. You see, Calyutron stands for California University Cyclotron. Here at Y12 in Oak Ridge, we had 1,152 batch processes, Calyutrons, that ran 24/7 for 2 years straight. Split between 2 different types of machines, alphas and betas, it took a workforce of over 22,000 people working around the clock here in Oak Ridge to do our small part to help win the war. That's where little old me comes in. You see, due to the war, there weren't enough men around to keep the Calyutrons running. So the US government went out to local schools and recruited some hardworking, whip-smart young ladies who knew how to get a job done. Now what that job was, they couldn't tell us. What we did know is that we were helping lead our nation to victory and get life back to normal. We just had to take a few precautions along the way. Keep quiet about the work we were doing, and don't wear any metal. The wildest part is that when it was all said and done, this 2-year round-the-clock endeavor produced less than a gallon in volume of uranium-235, the necessary material to arm the little boy atomic bomb and end the war. Well, I loved pulling the curtain back and telling you a little bit about my life story. As always, you can learn about all the secrets of Oak Ridge by going to exploreoakridge.com. Until next time, it's Katie the California University Cyclotron girl. Yeah, that's a mouthful. Katie the Calyutron girl, signing off.
What do you think about that? I think it's a cute idea, and they've done it really well. I think there's about 19 of those that are out on Explore Oak Ridge. The one that came out just last week is talks about the Scarborough 85, the desegregation of Oak Ridge in 1955, of Oak Ridge schools, Robertsville Junior High and Oak Ridge High School. And it does a good job of bringing that history to life for us. So some of the women, likely this one's a woman brazing, likely at K25. And this is a picture of 2 of the Calyutron girls that I used most recently, most frequently, Peggy Stewart and Ruth Huddleston. I had to, for a long while, there are people coming from DOE headquarters would call ahead and say they wanted to meet a Calyutron girl because the book, Denise's book, was being read by them, and they learned about some of them still being alive. So I would bring one of them over to the New Hope Center and meet them the next morning. I called Peggy one night, I don't know, about 7 or 8 o'clock at night. And I said, Peggy, I need you to be at the New Hope Center at 9 o'clock in the morning. The deputy secretary or whoever it was is coming. Well, that didn't mean much to her. She said, Ray, you don't understand. I don't get up till after 9 o'clock. But she did. She came every time I asked her to. And that's her. She loved to hug people. That's her when some of the Rosie the Riveters were here for a Secret City Festival. And that's Ruth in the middle and Peggy there. And this is Virginia Coleman. Virginia was not a Calitron girl. She was a chemist, and she worked at Y12 as a chemist. And Denise got to know her really well, Denise and her husband, Joe. And they spent about 2 to 3 years working on this book. And they would come frequently and spend time in Oak Ridge. And it got to where they were not staying in a hotel anymore. They were staying with Virginia. She just took them in and gave them a stay place while they were here in Oak Ridge. And this is Peggy and Ruth talking with the Deputy Secretary of Energy. Like I say, that for several, I don't know, a year or more, that was the highlight of the visits. This is a time where she was talking with the National Nuclear Security Administrator, who had just been appointed, and we were her first stop. Now, Ruth and I had a routine that we would go through when we were talking to someone. We did a presentation over at UT, and she did several things with me. And I would ask her, what did you think you were doing when you were working here? And she'd say, I didn't know. I just knew I was doing something to help win the war. And then I would say, well, now what did you think when you learned what you'd been doing? And she would say, well, my supervisor told us at work that day when the bomb was dropped that we'd been the ones making that uranium. And she said, I was proud because my boyfriend was in Germany and he had already told me that he was going to Japan. So I thought I've saved his life because there's going to be a lot of killing if they go into Japan. And then she says, I got home that night and I got to thinking and reading the newspapers and hearing on the radio about how many people we'd killed. And she said, I got so depressed I couldn't sleep for a week because I'd been a part of killing those people. When she said that, the administrator teared up, leaned up close to her, and said, Ruth, let me tell you why I understand how you felt. Said, let me tell you what my job is. And she went on to tell her that it's her responsibility to assure the president that if he wants to use a nuclear weapon, that they will work. And she says, I hope and pray we never have to use one. There's another lady, Jane Greer. Jane worked as a statistician at Y12. She went to the University of Tennessee and wanted to take wanted to major in an engineering curriculum. And they told her they could not give women engineer degrees at that time, but they said, we'll let you take all the courses that you want to, any of them, and we'll give you a degree as a statistician. So she did that and then came and worked for Y12, went on to have a career as in sports, managing some amateur sports. And then in 2010, they wrote her up in the University of Tennessee torchbearer, brought her there to the college or university, and they gave her a trophy and a recognition for the fact that she had been a graduate of UT, and Peyton Manning gave her the trophy. That made her day. She really enjoyed that. This is Denise and Ed Westcott. She really came to appreciate Ed for the photographs that he made, and got to know Ed personal. Every time she'd come to town, we'd look Ed up. I'd take her up to his house, and they just had a wonderful time together. She also got close to Bill Wilcox, who was the historian at that time. And it was a lot of fun to have all of them together while she was doing the research on their book. And there's Colleen Black in the middle. She had just spoken to a local book group. And that's her with Cindy Kelly and Denise. That's half of a book group that I spoke to. The other half's over on the other side of the room. Rosemary Lane was one of the Kayatron girls. And then there's the Polish translation of the book. That's at the Books A Million in Oak Ridge. And she's there with Rosemary. And I don't know where this came from. It's a picture of Colleen Black in her younger years, and it's on a bottle of the Atomic City cocktail. And it says, "You got no proof." So I don't know how high an alcohol content it was. That's where she's talking with Ruth Carey when she was over at the East Tennessee History Center. And that's my sweetie Colleen Black. She took over when Denise came and introduced her to all the Kayatron girls. Celia Klemsky was General Groves' administrative assistant, and Ellen Jernigan was there as well. These ladies just enjoyed being Kayatron girls and being recognized at this late stage in their life. In fact, they made a habit of going down to the bread store, Panera bread store, and they would take their pens with them and sit at a table in Panera's and sign books that people would bring by for them to sign. So when the paperback come out, it went again to the New York Times bestseller list. This is what General Groves had to say about Tennessee girls. He said, "Above all, I knew the labor supply of East Tennessee was of a very high order from a standpoint of willingness to work. And I knew that we had to use many female operators. Tennessee girls would be much more easily trained and would do better work than those from other sections of the country. The principal reason for this was that the women here were not sophisticated. They hadn't been reared to believe they knew it all." I couldn't say that today, but I can quote General Groves. This is a picture that Denise also saw on the internet and really liked, and helped to cause her to want to write the book. Ed's standing in a pickup truck here, and he's telling me in the back of a pickup truck, looking down at Alpha 1 and Alpha 2 buildings. And he's telling these women, "Walk toward me now." Notice this guy right here is just standing there like a knot on a log. He's not walking. So we recreated that picture when we were ending the documentary film, The Nuclear Family. We made 4 30-minute episodes for public television. And when we wanted to end, we needed something to wrap it up with. So we recreated this picture. And we had them coming out from the highly enriched uranium materials facility. Some of these people are descendants from the people who are in that original picture. And so we put Ed in the picture and had him to stand like that man was. That's me walking behind him saying, "Ed, don't move, don't move." And oh, by the way, this lady right here, I put this picture on in the Oak Ridge when we were opening or cutting the ribbons for the New Hope Center and the Jack Case Center. And I said, "Any of you ladies that are still alive, come and have lunch with us and help us cut this ribbon." This little lady here did, Dorothy Coker. This lady in the black sash did. This one with the polka dot dress did. And this lady here with the coat over her arm was Miss Atomic Bomb in 1945. So she was delightful to have here. Just a little bit more about Denise. That's Fanny and me over at Denise's bookstore in Asheville, North Carolina, when she was bringing out the new book. Our new book at that time was The Last Castle. And it's about the castle that's there in Asheville, North Carolina.
Biltmore.
Biltmore, thank you. It's the Vanderbilt's castle, Biltmore Castle. And then she's written another book, We Gather Together, that's a history of Thanksgiving and how that one woman brought this book to life, or brought the idea of celebrating Thanksgiving. and actually got Abraham Lincoln, when he was president, to designate it as a national holiday. Denise and Joe have written other books about the signers of the Declaration of Independence, the signers of the Constitution, and one that says stuff every American should know. Those are good books if you're interested in them. This is where I had Ruth on with me on a Zoom talk to a lot of city clerks that were doing a webinar. This is where Denise Kiernan came to Oak Ridge and had a panel discussion with several of the Cayetron girls. And I'm not going to take the time to let you listen to that because it's a long one. And remember, the Army Corps of Engineers was also something that brought a lot of women into the Manhattan Project. And this is an article that was written about them. It was established in June of 1944, had initially 74 women. And they came to Oak Ridge and to Los Alamos. A few were in Hanford, but most of them were in some other locations, but most of them were in Oak Ridge or in Los Alamos. 422 by the war's end had, and this is a picture of them in Oak Ridge. They handled records and reports, classified files, and they were typically not used as engineers or scientists, although a few of them did work in that role. And this is one that served in Oak Ridge. Wilma Gray enlisted in the Army alongside her twin brother in August of 44. And they had an older sister who was a civilian prisoner of war in Japan. She boarded a train and came to an unknown destination in Oak Ridge. That's her picture. And she made an adjustment, worked as a general secretary at K-25, and was promoted to staff sergeant. Met her husband while she was away, and she was here until she left in August of 1946. This is one Kim Geis from the World War II Museum, and fluent in German, Yiddish, and specializes in the American prisoner of war experience in World War II. Now, this is, if you talk about women in the nuclear age, you have to start with Marie Curie and note the things. She's awarded 2 Nobel Prizes, discovered radium and radioactivity. Her daughter also was awarded a Nobel Prize. Lise Meitner is one that was overlooked for a Nobel Prize in 1945. It was awarded to Otto Hahn for the discovery of nuclear fission in 1939. Actually, it was Meitner that made that discovery, and Hahn was working with her, but she didn't get included in the submission for the Nobel Prize. She was awarded the Enrico Fermi Award in 1966, and she has an Element 109 named for her. Catherine Way worked in Oak Ridge, and she was the person that recommended during a dinner event to William Pollard that the X-10 graphite reactor should be a national laboratory. Pollard then went on to get 14 Southern universities to join a consortium and exerted the political pressure necessary to get a national laboratory designated in the South. They were creating them in Chicago, New York City, out in California, but to create one in the rural South was just a tremendous struggle to get the political support for that. Pollard was able to do it, and he went on to form first Orins, ORINS, and that's where the hospital was for a while that treated terminally ill cancer patients, and learned a lot about how to help in that area. And then eventually that became Oak Ridge Associated Universities. This lady here was passed over for a Nobel Prize and has an asteroid named for her. I'm not sure, I don't know much more about what she did during the Manhattan Project, but she was an active participant there. This one here, Leona Woods, was the youngest person and only female at the CP1, Critical Power 1 experiment in Chicago. And she was also at Hanford during the Manhattan Project. And she's the one that recognized the problem that we were having when they were putting the plutonium and producing the plutonium, and their reactors were actually shutting down because they were being poisoned by the process that they were using. And she was able to tell them what the problem was and how to correct it. Now, this is a lady that, excuse me, a lady that I knew personally. Fanny, my wife, worked for her for 15 years, Evelyn Watson. Evelyn was with the Oak Ridge Associated Universities and ran the Radiation Internal Dose Information Center. And what that meant was anywhere that there was a radiation incident anywhere in the world, ORIU's REACTS program would respond to it, and Evelyn and her group would be the ones that would do the dose calculations for any of those exposures. Now, as a side note, Fanny and I got invited to Vail, Colorado in February of 2020. I had given a tour in August of 2019 to a man and his wife and 3 other couples. And they wanted to meet me in the parking lot of the American Museum of Science and Energy. So I met them there, and they were in a Mercedes van and had a chauffeur driving it. So I thought, oh, this is going to be a different tour. First thing they wanted to do was to go to Calhoun's, and they had rented the entire event center for one table of cold sandwiches for lunch. I said, my goodness, this is something else. But I gave them the tour, and I figured, well, you know, that was it. We had the tour. And then in December, I got another call from the same lady that set that tour up and said that the people were so impressed with the tour that they wanted to invite me to come to Vail, Colorado for a roundtable the last week in February. This gentleman and his wife have a home in Vail, and they set their 2-car garage up, put a heated tent over the outside, and set a table in the middle of it and have a round table discussion. They invite 20 people that they've seen during the year on tours that they think would be interesting enough to be shared. And they bring them there, all expenses paid. Took us skiing one day. I didn't ski. I rode the ski lift up, took pictures, and rode the ski lift back down. And they took us on snowmobile rides and dog sleds. So we had a good time, but we would do the round table every morning and then do the fun in the afternoon for 3 days. And I told them when we went out there, I said, look, my wife has got a presentation that I think you would enjoy. And they agreed to give her an hour as well. So she made a presentation about the Radiation Internal Dose Information Center. And I want to tell you, she was the hit of the program. So that's a fond memory that I have of Evelyn Watson and of Fanny working for her for 15 years. And of course, you know, Leanne Russell, Leanne and Bill were hired in the biology division as husband and wife, worked there, did some tremendous experiments with mice and radiation, and learned a tremendous amount about the impact of radiation on living. so living organisms. I think I'm going to try to show you this one. I may not have time for both.
From modest and humble beginnings to secret missions to being one of America's best resources for new technology, these valleys in East Tennessee have a rich and diverse history. We want to honor those who came before us. We want to keep our place in history alive by revealing the secrets of our hidden past. In 1946, the Second World War had ended, a war that Y-12 worked tirelessly to help end. In spite of its efforts to help win the war, Y-12's whole existence was threatened. You see, the K-25 gaseous diffusion process had come to be regarded as more productive for enriching uranium, more productive than Y-12's wartime calutrons. The once booming Y-12 quickly went from over 22,000 employees down to less than 2,000, and many buildings were left vacant. Just over Chestnut Ridge, a sister facility was facing its own set of challenges after the war. X-10 had just become a national lab, the Clinton National Laboratory to be exact, and was well on its way to becoming the Oak Ridge National Laboratory that we know today. And then there was the fashioning of a whole new division, a division that would be focused on research and study the effects of radiation on living things, on organisms like fungi, plants, mammals, insects, a biology division. And for the director of this new division, the then Director of Research and Development at the Clinton Labs, Dr. Eugene Wigner, looked to the National Institute of Health.
They were trying to find somebody, and they asked some people at the National Institutes of Health about it, and nobody was interested, but Hollander was interested and came up with a program immediately about particularly genetic research, and sure enough, they funded it.
Turned out Dr. Alexander Hollander was the perfect choice. A German immigrant, he already knew a thing or two about radiation and living things. He'd been working on research of his own, studying the effects of ultraviolet radiation on living organisms. He was driven, focused, and a visionary. Hollander saw a facility that looked not just into the radiological effects on living things. He visualized a research facility for all things biological and biomedical that shared ideas and findings, a research facility that collaborated with other researchers around the world. But for a research facility of this size, well, X-10 found himself in quite a quandary. There just wasn't any space available, or money for new construction. Money was tight following World War II for all government facilities, and so building a new building for a new division simply was not an option.
And they didn't have much room over here at ORNL, but they did have a lot of buildings over at Y-12. And when the war effort winded down, those buildings were vacated. And so it made a perfect opportunity for a growing research division to expand into that area.
Buildings like 9207, 9208, 9210, and 9211 that were once used to prepare material for the Y-12 calutrons were left vacant and were big enough to accommodate this new biological research division for the Oak Ridge National Laboratory. But of course, security was tight at Y-12, and this posed a problem for the new division. But sensible German Hollander had a solution for that.
Alex was trying to negotiate for the use of a building. Finally, he yelled, "Well, why can't you build a fence around us?" That made it a done deal. He got that building and the adjacent one, both surrounded by a security fence.
But these buildings weren't intended for biological research, so some renovations were needed. But Hollander had already started assembling his team, so he found temporary labs for those researchers to begin work.
It was in a wing of the building that also housed the original X-Tank cafeteria. We only had just maybe 3 or 4 rooms, maybe more than that in the wing. And the end room became the mouse room. And all of it was a very temporary housing. We knew we were going to be moving, so it didn't much matter.
Slowly, as renovations were finished, each team of researchers would move into their new facilities.
The rest of the biology division moved before we did because their facilities were in a different building and they had been completed before ours. Our particular group moved in probably January of 1949. We moved into building 9210.
And so began the renowned Oak Ridge National Laboratory's Biology Division and the fantastic discoveries that would change the world of science and medicine forever. Research done here in the Bear Creek Valley at Y12.
I'm going to let you watch the two. It was the early 1950s. The nation was at rest following its greatest war. But in the quiet valleys of East Tennessee, a small group of scientists was beginning to cause quite a stir. The Oak Ridge National Laboratory was pioneering research on living things. Only this research wasn't happening at the lab itself. It was taking place on the other side of Chestnut Ridge at Y12. In buildings donated to the lab by Y12, the new biology division found a home. It was here at Y12 where some great scientific minds assembled that ORICL became a world leader in biological research. Some of the early breakthroughs came from the persistent efforts of a hard-working husband and wife team. Working in a building nicknamed the Mouse House, Doctors Bill and Leanne Russell were studying how radiation affects reproduction in mammals. While Bill studied these effects on reproductive cells, Leanne focused on the effects in the earliest stages of life.
I was getting involved in mapping out the developmental stages, embryonic developmental stages, at which you would get different types and different degrees and different frequencies of various malformations, like, legs and toes and ribs and all that kind of stuff. Making the correspondence between the timing of mouse embryos and human embryos, it turned out that some of the really hazardous stages were during a time when most women would not realize that they were pregnant. And so we made this recommendation that if radiation could be postponed, like if it was a diagnostic radiation, that it should be scheduled to the 2 weeks following menstrual period. So that became known as the 14-day rule. Some people call it the 10-day rule. And it was adopted fairly early, like in the 50s. And it's been internationally in use ever since then.
For the 50 years that followed, the 14-day rule has helped prevent millions of potential birth defects. The other Dr. Russell, Bill, is not here to tell us about his research, but his legacy lives on.
I think his very early work was wonderful, the one with the ovarian transplantation. But after he got here, I think finding the various conditions that changed mutation rates were what he considered most significant. Another very important one was a so-called dose rate effect, namely that if you spread out the dose instead of giving it all in one shot, that the mutation rate dropped to about 1/3.
This discovery led to the national and international standards
for safe levels of radiation exposure for humans that we still use today. Now, during this time, another scientist was getting some notice, putting things on ice. Dr. Peter Mazur's specialty was cryobiology.
Cryobiology is the scientific study of the effect of cold on living organisms. People had attempted to freeze embryos and eggs, but had gotten absolutely nowhere. And so we're beginning to understand the factors under which cells were killed or not killed. So we took the knowledge we had and said, well, it seems to us that this is the way we ought to do it. Try it. And it was a pretty heady experience because we tried 2 experiments, and in those 2 experiments solved the problem basically in 10 days. And one of the tests of whether you successfully frozen embryos is to transfer them into a foster mother, a surrogate, and see if you get baby mice. And lo and behold, we got baby mice. In fact, those baby mice appeared on the cover of Science magazine in October of 1972.
In similar research, Mazur and his team successfully froze sperm that was later injected into a female mouse, and the pregnancy took. This technique was quickly adopted by the livestock industry.
In 2008, I think it was, the cattle industry froze 250 million doses of bull sperm, and those were used to inseminate 100 million cows over the world, and this resulted in a tremendous increase in the genetic productivity of cattle.
These discoveries create even more possibilities for the future, like preserving organs for transplant and preserving endangered animals. These are but a few of the snapshots of contributions made by ORICL's Biology Division, contributions that have left a long legacy made here at Y12.
All right, let me now cover some more women from the Oak Ridge National Laboratory. Jim Campbell suggested this one, Dottie Silverman. She was assistant to Aldo Kahn and also ran this Oak Ridge Civic Music Association office, and was the secretary to the Oak Ridge chapter of the Federation of Scientists. And there's a link to her oral history. Doris Scott was a nurse at Oak Ridge National Laboratory from 1948 to 1955. Interestingly enough, there was a meningitis outbreak in the 40s that hit Oak Ridge's Black community particularly hard. And she worked with local agencies and the hospital to share health information with the local families. A blood screening event, she helped to organize the local Citizens Health Committee and drew 1,500 participants. In 1952, President Harry Truman appointed Scott to serve on the Industrial Health section of the President's Committee for Health. She was one of just 10 professionals invited to join that panel. And then Frances Pleasanton, Arthur Snell described in an article proof of neutrons' radioactivity obtained by physics at ORICL. He and Pleasanton opened a hole in the 7-foot thick concrete wall or shield of the graphite reactor, and a stream of neutrons that came through the hole in a well-defined beam. Now, you know that at ORICL we now have the spallation neutron source that is the world's most powerful pulsed neutron source. They're literally building the second target station for that. And we also have the high flux isotope reactor. That's a source of a constant stream of neutrons similar to what they had here at the graphite reactor, even more powerful. Snell describes their two pursuits, the observation of neutrino recoil and charge spectrometry of radioactive rare gases. And he wrote about that. Nobody had seen them before, and Tony and I were quite excited to see them for the first time. She authored and co-authored a number of scientific publications, and in '58, she and Snell studied the decay of helium-6, confirmed that the electroneutrino theory of beta decay. Her lab was visited in '58 by Queen Frederica of France, '59 by King Hussein of Jordan. She remained in Oak Ridge after retirement, local in environmental affairs. Finally, Libby Johnson. Libby was an ORNL physicist, and she's at a new control panel there for the ORNL's Buck shielding facility in 1957. She was among the first females to operate a nuclear reactor, and she blazed the trails for women doing that. Thank you for letting me present this material to you today. And if you have any questions about what we've just talked about, we can answer those questions. Let me check the chat. Okay. Any thoughts or questions about what we've talked about today?
Well, Ray,
Yes.
something that was brought up a lot earlier about 2 or 3 people talking about, Hiroshima. I actually knew the first Japanese military officer who was in Hiroshima after the bomb. And the story is almost not even believable, but I graduated from a school up in upstate New York called Brockport and lived there for a few years later. And a guy who was on the faculty there, he was a psychologist. His name was Dr. Ashida. And he also, among other things that he did, he was a really remarkable person. He ran a local through the continuing ed office in the college, a judo club that was just, there were like hundreds of people would go. And he actually was the Olympic judo coach in 1976 for the American judo team. The Olympics were held in Montreal, and he brought the team there that summer in '76. And he later was a official at later Olympics, and he was the highest degreed black belt in the world at that time. He was a 9th degree. So I got to know him just a little bit. He was a very modest person. Well, when he passed away, not all that many years ago, the college did an obituary for him. And as it turned out, he was in the Japanese military studying to be I guess that, I don't know, studying is the right term, training to be a kamikaze pilot. But because of his age, he hadn't been sent out. So the day after the bomb was dropped in Hiroshima, they put him in a small airplane. They sent him to Hiroshima. He landed outside Hiroshima, and he found a bicycle, and he rode into Hiroshima on the bicycle and saw just, obviously horrific things. And he never talked about that. But one of the things that they mentioned in his obituary was that he maintained later that basically that he knew that the Japanese would have never, ever surrendered had the bomb not been dropped, that they were prepared to fight, giving sticks to kids. And so, that was his take, which I thought was pretty final in my mind as to, justification of the bomb being dropped.
I agree with you, and I've heard others say the same thing that knew what the Japanese were doing. I even have a close friend whose mother was in Japan at the time as a young girl, and was literally being trained to fight with sticks, and they were preparing for the invasion. I also know that the emperor used information, and I don't know if it was from the person you're talking about or not, but he used information about those bombs. When the one was dropped in Hiroshima, someone went in and reported back to him. And then when it was dropped in Nagasaki, the same person was sent there and came back and told him that there were two different bombs and that they were mighty powerful bombs and may very well have influenced the emperor's decision to surrender. Jackie, did you have something you wanted to say?
Yes, I have met a gentleman by the name of Gerald Byington who is getting close to retirement age. And he designed, and there was actually, I don't believe he got any particular recognition for it, but he designed both storage containers as well as the shelving and that sort of thing. But I know as part of what he does, they do drop tests and all that sort of thing when nuclear materials are going to travel. I don't know whether you've ever met him. I just know that he's close to retirement. I don't know whether he would be willing to say anything, but you might enjoy speaking with each other. I can give you contact information if you want.
I would appreciate that. Do you have my email address?
I think I do.
Yeah, just draysmith@comcast.net.
Okay, all righty.
Send anything to me you'd like for me to have, and I'll try to make the contact. Okay.
Okay.
Folks, we're about 3 minutes away from ending today, and anyone else have a question or comment? I'll tell you a little about what we're going to do next week. Okay. Next week, I'm going to have as my guest Lee Redding. Lee is a retired professor from the University of Tennessee. Lee asked me a few years ago if I would co-teach a course with him on the history of the Manhattan Project. And I agreed to do that. Now, I just told stories. He taught the course. But at any rate, after we finished the course, I told him, I said, Lee, you've got enough material here that would make a really good book. And he actually agreed with me, and we formed a writing team of Lee, myself, Al Ekabus, and Bill Bug, and we put together a book about the relationship between the University of Tennessee and Oak Ridge. It's going to be coming out in a few months this summer, and I want him to give you a presentation about that book. So we'll have Lee Redinger on next Monday and have him talk about the upcoming book. Thank you all very much for the time that you spent with me this morning. And if I can get to this thing in time, I can turn it off before it alarms. Thank you all.
Thank
And
you.
we'll
Thank
see
you.
you
Thank you, Ray.
next week. Okay.